This is going to be the best conditioned, hardest working, most professional, unselfish, toughest, nastiest, most disliked segment in Takeline history. Because we're talking about brute force. We're talking about the bludgeoning 1990s New York Knicks with the author of Blood in the Garden, a flagrant history of the 1990s New York Knicks. Sports Illustrated's Chris Herring joins us now. Chris, welcome to Takeline. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate that. I hope you're not all that nasty and tough on me as the author. I'm just the messenger for the whole situation.
So I was paraphrasing Pat Riley there, who of course set the tone for this era of Knicks history. For people who are not versed in the 90s Knicks, talk to us about that team, their place in the league at that time, and their impact on the NBA.
They were not much when Riley got there. I mean, to the extent that Riley actually kind of threatened not to come on board because of it, because Patrick Ewing wanted out. They'd been so much of a mess.
Golden State, baby.
Yeah, like 5 or 6 coaches in 5 years, and you know, 3 or 4 general managers in that time. Patrick Ewing was supposed to be a savior. Instead, he was, you know, taking his licks just like everybody else. And Riley obviously understood the market, but wasn't trying to walk into a situation where he wasn't going to have a franchise player. You know, he obviously had all sorts of accolades as the coach from the Lakers, and, you know, is coming over from a big NBC job, a comfortable NBC job. So he wanted to have, you know, be coming in on good footing. And it was kind of a mess. And I think Riley saw something. I think there were some people that expected him to kind of try to take the Knicks and do the Showtime thing. The Knicks did not really have a Showtime roster at all. And I think Riley very wisely saw them as more of a team that could kind of carry out a lot of the same things that the Pistons did before they aged out. And I think he saw the Pistons as having a successful game plan to try to beat the team that was going to be the dominant force in the East. And the Bulls, he just figured the Pistons aged out. The Knicks were younger, and the Knicks had a roster that was capable of carrying out that sort of plan. So that's kind of what they were, is like the new age Pistons with less offense. And they got really close to winning a championship that way. And, you know, I think Riley, it's interesting. You talk to enough people throughout that time and around the league, they'll tell you that they think that that's the best coaching job he did, because there was talent. I think people sell them a little bit short as far as saying they had no talent. I don't think they had no talent, but they didn't have the Bulls level of talent. And, you know, they did get very, very close to beating them when Jordan was there. They did beat them when Jordan was not. And they got really, really close to beating them, not beating the Bulls, but winning a title in that year where Jordan wasn't there. And actually the first 2 times that Michael retired, they made it to the finals immediately after that. And I think that speaks volumes about the fact that they would have been the team right behind the Bulls had the Bulls not been the Bulls.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting because we talk about game planning for sports, and you definitely had to have a game plan. You interviewed over 200 people. First of all, that's like ridiculous. That's a lot of interviews, Chris. But secondly, it's like, how did you plan for who you were going to talk to? Like, who did you talk to? And out of those interviews, what was the most interesting, crazy thing you heard, like someone told you?
Well, I was 4 when they hired Pat Riley, so I figured I needed to interview everybody, just because, you know, I almost turned down the opportunity to do the book because I figured I wasn't old enough. I didn't know enough about the teams. And the beautiful thing about that is that the people that were reaching out to me trying to get me to do it were like, that's great. We like that you don't know much about it, because we know enough about your work history that you'll want to dig into it and try to find answers for yourself instead of just assuming that you know them already. So
right.
I talked to, you know, it's funny for this sort of project, obviously you want to get all the big names, but I focused on a lot of the small ones that people have never heard of. I got a lot of advice from people that had done this before, where they've talked to hundreds of people, and you go through and you try to find the folks that nobody's talked to. Everybody's heard Pat Riley, they've heard Patrick Ewing, they've heard John Starks. These are guys that are still in the media now. So you talk to the secretaries and the marketing people and the family members and the friends of Anthony Mason's and the people that got cut 3 days into training camp. in my mind, it seems backwards, but the thing is, when you talk to enough of those people, they remember some of that stuff so vividly.
Yeah, because it was the
because
big deal to them.
Because their interaction with Patrick Ewing was a massive deal because they only had one of them. And, Patrick Ewing had so many encounters with so many people that it all gets lost. They all get asked the same questions. And so you build up kind of this portfolio of all these questions you get to ask those major figures once you get to it. So I spent a lot of time talking to those folks. I obviously worked my way up the chain as well. There were some people that I didn't get to talk to. Riley is one that rarely speaks for projects like these. But, for the most part, I got just about everybody at one time or another, at least got to meet everybody. And, in some cases where I couldn't have, obviously Anthony Mason's one of the big ones that passed away a few years ago. And I felt it was such a big deal to try to get to everybody in his orbit, not the teammates so much. I did talk to all of them, but the family members, the friends, the barber, the women in some cases, the people that he feuded with, the people that traded for him, the people that despised him, the people that loved him, and the people that prayed for him. Just people that had a lot to do with him and that he really cared about. Because I've said this in tweets and stuff like that, but I feel like he was the person I wanted to be most careful with because there's already so much notorious stuff out there about him. He's not here to defend himself. I take that very seriously, but I also wanted to try to give a really layered portrait of what he was like. And I think I did that. That was actually the second chapter of the book that I wrote. It's not the second chapter in the book, but in terms of when I wrote it really early because I wanted to make sure that the tone of it was right before I did anything else.
You often hear the league is better when the Knicks are good. So this is a period of time when the Knicks were good. They were an elite team, always in the mix. And at the same time, I think it's fair to say, and I say this as a fan, an ardent fan that grew up on that team, you could make an argument that they almost ruined the NBA with the way they played. And certainly, I think that the rule changes that came in the early part of the 2000s were in large part an answer to the kind of style that the Knicks promulgated and Pat Riley put in place. What was the view of the team and the way they played around the league and in the league office? Obviously they're like, oh, this is great. Like NBA and NBC is popping off. Bob Costas going crazy. But were there concerns about the style of play?
Oh, my God. I mean, the rules, and it's so funny because some of them didn't even go through, but some of the rules changes that the league wanted to make. The league at one point had something on the table where they were going to start suspending coaches if their players had a certain number of flagrant fouls collectively. And I don't think it almost went through because I think even Phil Jackson said that's going a step too far. And Phil obviously kind of despised the Knicks during those years. So, it was at that level where they were so worried about the flagrant foul numbers that they were talking about suspending coaches for it. And that was where, as you talk about the league and the direction they went, like the flagrant foul point totals and the suspensions after you get past a certain number of them, that happened essentially because of the Knicks. That happened the year after Charles Oakley had more than twice as many flagrants as everybody else, where he had more flagrant fouls.
They were killing people. They were killing people.
He had more flagrant fouls than 15 teams did that year. So it was, they were the reason that a lot of this stuff happened. And Doc went as far as to call them, when I talked to him, he talked about them as being like anti-Knick rules, which is interesting, from my perspective. I was like, that seems a little over the top. And then I talked to people from the league and they're like, we wouldn't call them that, but we wouldn't necessarily disagree with the idea that they probably were the face of the physicality after the Pistons, once you rolled into the 90s. And, if the Knicks feel like they were kind of the poster child of that and that it was taken out on them, we weren't looking to take it out on them, but I would understand them thinking that it impacted them more than everybody else because they were the team that everybody thought of that played that style and other teams kind of copied. So in some ways it probably did feel like that to them. So I don't think it was wrong of Doc to say they were anti-Knick rules. Maybe not specifically, but very generally it kind of was. And it did, eventually kind of change the way they played. Now they were still really physical and they still got in plenty of fights. They didn't really learn their lesson from the fights they got in earlier in the decade against the Suns and the Bulls, and it really came back to bite them in the ass against the Heat.
Oh God!
And and the Suns actually came back to bite them in the ass as well years later with the Steve Nash and Amari Stoudemire teams. But that's actually what I think is the interesting part of the book. I get that the Knicks were certainly not everybody's cup of tea. I've been asked a lot of questions already about like, why would you write about a team that didn't win a championship? And I guess there's two reasons. One, the teams that do win championships often are written about, and they have documentaries made about them, and they have documentaries made about their stars. And Scottie Pippen has his own book coming out. Has his own book come out earlier this week.
I haven't heard about that. Does he have a book?
Yeah, I feel like I haven't heard much news about that. So there's so much done on those teams already. So number one, it's interesting to just look at something that was adjacent, but maybe not the focal point. The Knicks were never the focal point. But two, the Knicks probably had as much impact on the history of that era as any other team outside of the Bulls, really. I guess you could argue the Rockets, but the Knicks had more to do with the rules changing than anybody. And I think we would have eventually gotten to the place that we're at now, rules-wise, with the wide open NBA. But I don't know that it would have happened as quickly as it did because of those teams. So if not for those teams. So, I think that part of it is interesting. Love them or hate them, they certainly were in the picture all the time. I keep comparing them to Forrest Gump. They weren't the focal point of the picture, but they were like off to the side, or they were like shaking the president's hand when they needed to use the bathroom because they drank 12 beers with Reggie Miller or with Michael Jordan or with the OJ chase or what have you. All that stuff involved the Knicks in some way, and they were in the photo. They just weren't the focal point of it.
Well, it's interesting because we're talking about how all those instances, those flagrant fouls accelerated the game. But I'm curious if you would know, how do the big names from those players in the 90s feel about the state of play right now with the current Knicks, the Ewings, the Oakleys, Starks? Like, what do you think they view the current state of the New York Knicks as? Like, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I could tell you how Oakley feels about him. Might have the strongest feelings of anybody. And I think it explains kind of why he's been on the outs with the team for so long. He does not really see much similarity between those teams and the ones of the last few years. But I mean, I also think that is one of the things. I don't get into it a whole lot, but I do dip my toe in it. That was the period of time when Jim Dolan took over the team right at the end of the period I was writing about. So that's one of the major differences, is that they are owned by essentially a single person now, as far as the person that gets to make the decisions. So that's a major difference. The Knicks were corporately owned several times during the 90s. And so kind of played a role in why they couldn't easily just give Pat Riley an ownership stake in the team. And so that's one of the key differences. John Starks still works for the team. And so, and he's always kind of been a happy-go-lucky sort of character. And so I think he probably is happy with the way the Knicks look now. And, while I don't know that you would get him to admit it, candidly, I'm sure he probably felt like stuff was maybe a little bit of a mess during the last, 10, 15 years as well. But again, works for the team. And Patrick Ewing's an interesting case too. I don't think he's ever really said a really negative word. The closest that he came was a few months ago when his team was on the cusp of winning there, I guess at the very beginning of the Big East tournament that they played at the Garden. And he was really frustrated when he was asked and kind of badgered to show his ID, to show that he was credentialed to be there, as if he was like a random stranger at the Garden. And he seemed pretty frustrated about that. And so it is interesting to see these undercurrents of those sorts of things that like still exist in just kind of a weird sort of place for those sorts of reasons. But no, I mean, I think that the memories of the 90s are fond. I think the interesting thing is that when you talk to most of these guys from those teams, though, they all more or less feel that the league needed to move forward. Like, I think Oakley might be the one holdout that stuff should go back to exactly the way it was back then. But I think as far as just the physicality, there was a real chance that somebody was going to get hurt. And, most people like that the game has opened up some. And I think with Ewing and some of those guys, you talk to them, they talk about how they would have thrived even more in a league like this, where they weren't being banged constantly. They had shooting ability. John Starks led the league in 3-point makes one year. So, I mean, like, he would have fit in fine. as an undersized guy where you couldn't hit him and touch him as much. And Ewing would have extended his range 2 or 3 feet and he was arguably one of the best 7-foot jump shooters then. And I imagine he'd be even more so now.
What is the craziest story that was told to you or that you uncovered through this process?
They'd kill me. They'd kill me. They're gonna kill me.
Good start already.
They're gonna kill me anyway because I think I'm supposed to be in a spot where they're like, well, you can do interviews that touch on the book a little bit, but are about the NBA as a whole, but don't do any that are strictly about the book. So I'll hold back some of it, but I've told this one, and I do think it's funny enough that hopefully you haven't heard it. I was going to keep it out of the book entirely. I ended up putting it towards the very end. It was this story about Anthony Mason. He had been with the team for a total of 1 year. And if you've ever seen those camps that they have, those youth camps that they have, where you never get the star player for those camps. It's generally a guy
Hubert
that is
Davis,
exactly. And the kids, it makes no difference to them. Patrick Ewing, Starks is their favorite, but like they'll readily take a Hubert Davis that's 3 feet taller than they are, and they've seen him play before, so they're excited. So Mason was like by 1992, he was a really good example of that because he'd only been with the Knicks for 1 year. He was a guy that came off the bench. He's a guy that if you give him a little bit of cash for showing up, he's thrilled with it because he doesn't make that much money relative to the other guys. So he was the guy that agreed to do it. They said, we're going to give you $1,500. You show up for the 1 day. That was probably a decent percentage of his salary at the time. So he shows up, and it's the first annual youth camp that they have for players, young players to come by. And they're hosting the camp for like a weekend or 2-3 days. Mason comes by. He pulls up as the kids are walking into camp for the day in a limousine. The kids go nuts when they see Mason in the car, rolls down the window, and he just sits there. He's not getting out of the limo. 5 minutes pass, 10 minutes pass, 15 minutes pass. And finally, the team, the administrative director, Ed Tapscott, who later would become their GM, he comes out and he says, Mace, what are you doing? Like, kids are inside waiting for you. We're waiting for you. Why are you sitting here in this limo? And he's like, not getting out of the limo. And Ed Tapscott asks him why, because they've obviously agreed on this. He said, I need you to make it $2,000 even, and I need it today in cash.
What?
And so Ed Tapscott's like, I've already gotten these kids in here. They know they've seen you at this point. I need you to come in.
All the leverage. He has all the leverage at this point.
And this is like, I don't even know if you could get $2,000 out of an ATM today in cash.
Right.
Like you have to make several trips. You're probably going to get you need an override and all sorts of other stuff. So Ed Tapscott sends out like multiple staffers to go out with his ATM cards to go get cash from different places. So he's like, what choice do I have? So he does get Mace to come out. He does go inside with the kids. He plays with the kids for a little bit. He plays a scrimmage with one of them, with a group of them, and he ended up elbowing a kid in the nose and breaking his nose by accident, incidental. But breaks his nose. The kid is knocked out cold. His nose is gushing blood.
Oh my God!
I know you lying, Chris.
The kid wakes up. The Knicks are scared crapless that they're going to have to pay a lot of money in a lawsuit. But the kid wakes up smiling and asks Mason if he can sign his bloody T-shirt. Mason obliges. The camp ends without a lawsuit. And then as Mason's walking out, he walks over to Ed Tapscott, the man who got him to come to the camp in the first place. He said, oh, well, thanks for the cash. But by the way, the reason I wanted the cash, I'm going to go home and have the limo take me home. And I'm going to give that cash to my mom. She's going shopping today. And walked out. And so the whole idea was that he was going to keep the limo for several extra hours so that his mom could have like a joyride and a shopping trip.
And $2,000 cash to get on it. And then y'all probably still going to hit the direct deposit for $1,500 because it's already processed.
Right.
So he really made $3,500 in a limo for a day. What?
And then got mad.
And they say he was not a finesse player.
Well, he might not have been a finesse player, but he was a
Finesse
finesser.
the whole system.
Yeah. So I mean, that was
What?
Mace and then got upset with that Taps got when it got back to the actual general manager of the team that like he was trying to figure out why there was so much money allotted to the limo for that day or why the charge was so high. And it was like, well, Mace kept the limo for 4 extra hours, but Mace got mad at Ed Tapscott for ratting him out. He's like, how am I ratting you out when you just straight up hijacked the limo and
Mace,
hit me up
no, sir.
So he was an interesting dude and a sensitive dude. And I really think, I hope that comes across. That story wasn't going to make the book at all until my editor like forced me to put it in because it was just so, it had no tie to any one specific thing other than just saying how wild dude was. And I couldn't figure out a way to like fit it into the story. So I put it in the epilogue at the very end, but he was, I had so much fun writing about him, but he was complicated and I strained trying to figure out how to just tell his story fully without it just being this cartoon. I didn't want that. And a lot of his teammates from college, a couple of whom moved out of the room with him because they're like, I can't live with this dude anymore. A lot of them were telling me they had never spoken to reporters before because they did not want to just put him out there as just this crazy Looney Tune.
Wow.
And they wanted a sense that, like, had I called and asked to write a story about him, I don't know that they would have said yes, but something about it being a book and them knowing that I would have the space to fully get into his story seemed to kind of win a lot of them over. And now, they text me for updates all the time. Like, when's the book coming out? Who else did you talk to? What other stories did you get? So I'm excited, and I'm hopeful that that when his folks read it, that they feel like I handled it with care and that I wasn't just looking to tell just the craziest stories about him, because he was a really interesting dude that had a lot to him.
Well, he's an author and senior writer for Sports Illustrated. His new book, Blood in the Garden, will be available in bookstores nationwide January 18th. Pre-order it right now to get more amazing stories like the one you just heard, which is only one of many stories. Chris Harry, thank you for joining us on Takeline.
Thank you guys so much for having me. Really appreciate you guys and love what you do.